Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will give an introduction to those who have never used PowerBasic before or even considered taking up programming. Today we will look at subroutines and functions and what they do. Recently I read an article that described the act of writing a large program to being similar to the act of writing a book. I'd never considered this comparison before, as I've never written a book and always thought it to be more difficult than programming. However, it is an interesting analogy. When reading a book, either in electronic or the traditional paper version, you quickly find that the book has structure. There are chapters, and within each chapter there are paragraphs, and within those are sentences. This breaks up the narrative into bits that you, the reader, will find easier to read and understand. Within programs in general, and PowerBasic in particular, there are similar constructs, and that is what we're going to look at today. If we are creating an application, either in the PowerBasic Windows or the console compiler, we will automatically get a pbmain function. This is the initial function that's executed when your application is run. You can quite happily write all your code within this single function. For many small, simple applications, this is all you will need. However, although there is no limitation to the number of lines of code you can have within this function, it is much more readable and easier to maintain if you break your code up into smaller chunks. Just like chapters in a book, these would be subroutines. So in our simple program, let's assume we want to create 3 subroutines. 3 chapters, if you like, in our programming book. And we will give each of these subroutines a name. We are calling each of these subroutines, and I have deliberately named each of the subroutines starting with the 3 letters SUB to indicate that it is a subroutine, and then giving it some name. We have a subroutine that does some things, a second subroutine that does some more things, and a final subroutine that does the last things. These are the calls to the subroutines, but we'll need to give the detail of each subroutine later on. So further down our code, we would have a sub to indicate that this is a subroutine, we would have the name of the subroutine, and all of the code within that subroutine would be between the sub and the end sub commands. So there'll be one entry for each of these. Think of these as the chapters in your book. So when your application executes, it will call the first subroutine first, and it will execute all the code within that subroutine before it attempts to call the second subroutine. It will then execute all the code within that subroutine before it goes on to the last subroutine. It's also quite helpful if you're writing applications that other developers are going to be working on, or perhaps you may not work on again this application for several months, to give each of the subroutines a name that means something, that indicates the functionality that that subroutine is actually going to do. So if, for example, our application is going to be doing some file processing, our first subroutine could be to load the file. The second subroutine could be to process the file, and the final subroutine to save a copy of the updated file following our processing. So this makes it more obvious what each of these subroutines is actually going to do. Although we have put the word call before the name of the subroutine when we're calling it, the word call isn't actually required. You can put it in, and it makes it quite easy to find where subroutines are called by just searching for this within your code, but you don't actually need the word call in there. That would work and compile just as easily. So that handles the absolute basics of a subroutine. The other thing we're going to talk about are functions. What's the difference between a subroutine and a function? At first glance, they do look remarkably similar. If we create a local variable called strFile, which is going to be a string, we can create a function called getFileName. This function is different from a subroutine in that the function will return a value, in this case a string. What we've done here, having declared our local string variable, we have populated that string variable with the output from this function. And the purpose of this function is to return a file name. So having returned this file name from this function, we can pass that to the subroutine as a parameter. And we would have to change the subroutine to take that parameter in. So our code is now starting to get slightly bigger. We have declared a local variable, we have got the value of that local variable from a function, and we have passed the variable to the load the file subroutine. And the load the file subroutine is taking the file name in as a parameter, which is a string. And this variable can be referenced within the subroutine itself. Functions can go slightly further than that. We could do away with the strFile local variable altogether, and we could replace the variable we're passing with the function itself. Having done that, it would return exactly the same thing. It would return myfile.txt. So the principal difference between a function and a subroutine is that a function will return a value. That value is defined by what appears here after the name of the function. So this particular function is returning a string. Other functions could return one of the numeric types, but each of them will return one and only one value. A subroutine can take parameters, just the same as a function can. In many cases it's down to personal preference how you structure your code. You may use a lot of subroutines, or you may use mostly functions. One of the advantages in using functions, if you return, for example, a true or false to indicate that the function worked or did not work, is that you can make the calls to subsequent code conditional. For example, we could create a new function whose job it would be to test to see whether the file that we are looking at is actually valid or not. And it would return a value true if it was valid and a value false if it was not. You could then test this conditionally in your code, so only if the value returned was true would these three subroutines ever be called. So this is a short introduction to how subroutines and functions work. I'll be putting links at the end of the video and in the description below to other videos where you can actually see more detail on subroutines and functions. In the next video, we'll be covering the parameters passed to subroutines and functions and how they work. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.